6 years. What exactly have you built here?
I kept this company solvent. Twice.
Derek built relationships. Derek brought in clients. Derek made things happen. That's what running a business looks like.
Calvin, this isn't the time.
It's exactly the time. She needs to hear this. Nobody's saying you're not useful, Tess. You're great at the back office stuff. As of tonight, Derek is COO. He is the future of this company.
And what am I?
You've never built anything of value, Tessa.
My father announced my brother's promotion at the dinner table like it was a coronation. He had rehearsed every word, and when I asked one quiet question, he looked straight at me and declared that everything I had done for 6 years amounted to nothing. No doubt, no hesitation. He believed it completely. What he did not understand was that the very sentence he used to dismiss me was the same one that would cost him everything he spent 15 years building. So how does a woman called worthless end up owning it all? If that question is already pulling at you, stay with this story because the answer is not what most people expect. And if you have ever had your work dismissed by someone who should have known better, this one is for you. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We tell them every week. The answer to that question starts 6 years before that dinner. It starts in a warehouse on the east side of Fort Wayne, Indiana, where my father built something out of almost nothing, and where I made the mistake of believing that loyalty was something a family would eventually choose to repay. Whitcomb Fabrication and Supply began in a rented shop no bigger than a 2-car garage. My father, Calvin Whitcomb, had spent 20 years working on industrial floors before he decided he was done making money for other people. He understood metal tolerances, load-bearing specs, and the particular stubbornness required to keep a machine running past the point where most men would have called it a loss. My mother, Marjorie, handled every customer conversation, every phone call, every handshake that my father was too impatient to make gracefully. Between the two of them, they built Whitcomb Fabrication into a real business, one that supplied fabricated metal components and specialized equipment to industrial contractors across the Midwest. By the time I graduated college, the company had outgrown its second location and was moving into a third. I came home because they needed help, and I thought 1 year of my time was a reasonable thing to give. I had a degree in finance and supply chain management, 2 job offers in other cities, and the complete certainty of someone who has never stayed anywhere long enough to get trapped. My father said he needed someone to get the financial side organized. My mother said it would be temporary. I believed them both, which is how 1 year became 2 and 2 became 6. And the job offers in other cities became something I stopped thinking about entirely. The work was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing that got mentioned at family dinners as an accomplishment. I managed cash flow and accounts receivable. I built the inventory tracking system from scratch because the one they had been using was essentially a spreadsheet held together with optimism and outdated formulas. I negotiated with suppliers, reviewed contracts before anyone signed them, monitored the banking relationship, tracked every invoice that was more than 30 days late, and spent a significant amount of time finding the small financial errors that accumulate invisibly inside a growing business until one of them becomes a crisis. None of this happened in front of customers. None of it involved wearing a hard hat or shaking hands at trade shows. It happened on a laptop at a desk near the back of the main office, and because it happened there, my father decided it was not quite real. Calvin Whitcomb's understanding of value was built entirely around what he could see and touch. A part coming off a machine was real. A sale closed on a handshake was real. A spreadsheet flagging a cash position problem 3 weeks before it became a payment default was, in his view, something closer to overcautious paperwork. He was not a stupid man. He simply had a very specific definition of what counted as building something, and everything I did fell slightly outside of it. I understood that about him early. I kept thinking I could change it. My brother Derek had no such problem with visibility. Derek was 23 when he started spending more time at the company, and he arrived with the energy of someone who had been waiting his whole life for an audience. He was good-looking in the way that made customers immediately comfortable quick with a joke, and skilled at the kind of surface-level confidence that reads as leadership until you look closely at the decisions underneath it. He took sales calls. He attended industry events. He talked about growth and opportunity in a way that made my parents feel like the company was heading somewhere exciting instead of managing its existing risks carefully. Calvin loved watching him work a room. Marjorie lit up every time Derek walked through the front door with a new contact's business card. They were not pretending to favor him. They believed without reservation that he was the one who understood what the company needed to become. Every time a quarter ended well, Derek got the credit in conversation. Every time something went sideways, a supplier dispute, a collections problem, a contract with ambiguous terms that needed to be untangled before it cost us money, I was the one my father called into the back office to fix it. There was no malice in this arrangement which somehow made it worse. They were not consciously diminishing what I contributed. They simply did not see it as contribution in the way they understood that word. I had no equity stake in the company. My title was something vague that effectively translated to financial operations, and my salary was lower than what we were paying 2 of our mid-level floor managers. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself the work would eventually speak loudly enough that the arrangement would have to change. That was the error I kept making for 6 years. I believed the work would speak for itself when the truth was that in my family's company, the work only spoke if someone with the right last name was standing next to it when it happened. The situation that finally broke everything open started with a contract that Derek was certain would change the company's future. He had been courting a relationship with a large agricultural equipment manufacturer for the better part of a year, and in the spring of what turned out to be my last year with the company, he came to my father with a proposal. The manufacturer was looking for a dedicated fabrication supplier. Derek believed Whitcomb Fabrication was positioned to win that business, but to win it at the volume they needed, we would have to open a second production line. That meant new equipment, expanded floor space, additional headcount, and a loan large enough to fund all of it before the revenue from the new contract could cover the cost. My father was excited in a way I had not seen him in years. He talked about it at dinner. He talked about it on the production floor. He described it to me as the moment the company moved from regional supplier to serious industrial player, and the pride in his voice when he said that was real and uncomplicated and completely disconnected from the financial reality of what he was agreeing to do. I asked Derek to show me the contract documentation before anything was signed. He sent over the file with the kind of confidence that comes from not having read it closely enough. I read it 3 times because I wanted to be certain I was understanding it correctly. The commitment from the manufacturer was not a long-term guaranteed purchase agreement. It was a conditional letter of intent, a document that indicated interest and outlined potential volumes but contained explicit language, allowing the customer to modify or reduce orders based on their own production needs with 60 days' notice. This meant that if the manufacturer's demand shifted, or if they found a cheaper supplier, or if their own sales slowed, they could reduce what they were buying from us without any meaningful financial consequence to them. We would still be responsible for the loan. We would still be paying for the equipment, the expanded facility, the new hires, and the raw material inventory we had ordered to support the projected volume. The contract gave them flexibility and gave us exposure. I put together a written analysis. I walked my father through the numbers, showing him what the cash position would look like at different order volume scenarios, full volume, reduced volume, and the floor case where the customer exercised the minimum commitment in the letter of intent. The floor case was not survivable without significant additional financing that we did not have access to. I was not telling him not to grow. I was telling him that the specific structure of this deal transferred all the risk to us while leaving the customer with an easy exit. There were ways to negotiate better terms. There were ways to scale the expansion more carefully and match our capacity build-out to confirmed order milestones rather than projections. Derek was in the room for most of that conversation. He listened the way someone listens when they have already decided the answer and are waiting for the other person to finish. When I was done, he told my father that I was being exactly what I always was, someone too focused on what could go wrong to recognize what could go right. He said that real business growth required accepting risk, and that my analysis was the kind of thinking that kept companies small forever. My mother, who had been standing near the doorway for part of the conversation, said something about how Derek understood the upside in a way that the financial side of the house sometimes missed. My father looked at the analysis I had prepared. He looked at my brother. He told me he appreciated the work, which was the thing he said when he had already made up his mind and wanted me to stop talking. They signed the loan documents 11 days later. I was not present when they signed. Derek sent me a text message that afternoon telling me the expansion was moving forward and that I should start building out the financial models for the new operation. I built the models. I kept working. I told myself that if the deal went badly, they would at least understand afterward what I had been warning them about. That was the second error. The understanding afterward is worth almost nothing if the thing you warned about has already happened. The dinner where everything ended was held at my parents' house on a Thursday in October. My mother had cooked. The table was set formally, which was unusual for a weeknight, and I remember noticing when I walked in that there were more wine glasses than necessary for just the four of us. My father had asked me to be there without explaining why. I assumed it was a general family dinner, the kind we had a few times a year when Marjorie decided the family needed to be in the same room for a few hours. Calvin made his announcement before the main course. He stood up with a glass of wine and told us that after careful consideration, he had decided that Derek would be stepping into the role of Chief Operating Officer effective the first of the month, and that this represented the beginning of a planned transition in which Derek would eventually take over leadership of the company entirely. He spoke about Derek's vision and energy. He talked about how proud he was of the business they were going to build together. He did not mention me at any point during the speech, except to say near the end that the whole family had contributed to getting the company where it was today, which he delivered the way people deliver lines that are technically true, but functionally meaningless. I had not known this was coming. I want to be precise about that because it matters. I was not passed over for a role I had been told I was in consideration for. I was not second in a decision that had been communicated to me as a competition. I simply was not part of the conversation at all. The decision had been made somewhere I was not invited about a company I had spent 6 years keeping financially functional, and I found out about it at a dinner table with a wine glass in my hand. I asked one question. I kept my voice level and I asked what the last 6 years of my work were worth in the context of a decision about the company's leadership. It was a reasonable question, and I asked it as calmly as I could manage, and Calvin looked at me from across the table and answered it in front of everyone without hesitation or apparent discomfort. He said that what I did was paperwork. He said that Derek was the kind of person who actually built a business, who went out into the world and made things happen, and that there was a difference between supporting a company and building one. Then he said the sentence that closed the door on everything. He said it the way you say something you have believed for a long time, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact they see no reason to soften. You've never built anything of value, Tessa. My mother did not say anything in response to that. She looked at her plate. Derek reached over and refilled his own glass and made a comment about how the company was going to do things differently now, more aggressively, which was his version of moving the conversation forward. He offered me a role under his leadership, said it like he was extending something valuable to someone who should be grateful for the offer. I did not say yes. I did not say no. I sat at that table for the remainder of the dinner because leaving immediately would have been a scene, and I had spent 6 years not making scenes. The next morning, I drove to the office before anyone else arrived. I left my keys on my father's desk. I wrote nothing. No resignation letter, no summary of outstanding projects, no list of the things that would fall apart in the next 30 days if no one was watching them closely. I left the keys and I walked out of the building, and before I reached my car, I heard my father's voice behind me. He had arrived early, which he sometimes did. He was standing in the doorway. He said that I would be back when I realized nobody else in the world needed what I did. He said it quietly, without anger, in the tone of someone who is confident they are right and is willing to wait to be proven so. I kept walking. I got in my car. I drove to Naomi Reddick's apartment on the west side of the city where she had a couch and enough sense to not ask me questions. I wasn't ready to answer, and I sat there for a long time in the quiet of a Thursday morning, trying to understand what it meant to have given 6 years to a place and left it with nothing except the certainty that staying any longer would have cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I did not know yet what I was going to do next. I did not have a plan. I had a finance degree, a set of skills my father had spent years describing as secondary, and the first full day in 6 years with nowhere I was required to be. What I did know, the one thing I was certain of when I walked out of that parking lot, was that I was not going back. Whatever came next, whatever it cost, whatever it required me to build from nothing in a city where the only professional identity I had was tied to a company that no longer wanted me in any role that mattered, I was not going back to the desk near the back of that office to fix problems for people who had just told me in front of my entire family that the fixing was worthless. My father was wrong about one thing. Other people did need exactly what I could do. It just took me a little while to find them. Naomi Reddick did not ask me what I was going to do. She made coffee and put it on the counter where I could reach it, and she let me sit in her apartment for 3 days without requiring anything from me in return. That kind of generosity is rarer than people admit, and I have never forgotten it. By the 4th day, I was ready to move again, not because I had a plan, but because staying still had started to feel like an answer I wasn't willing to give my father. The first month was the hardest, and not for the reason I had expected. Money was tight but manageable. I had savings, and I had always lived carefully, partly by disposition, and partly because my salary at Whitcomb Fabrication had never been generous enough to allow for anything else. The thing that was difficult was the identity problem. I had spent 6 years building my professional sense of self entirely inside one company, and when I walked away from it, I discovered that I did not have a clean answer to the question of what I actually was outside of that context. My degree was real. My skills were real. But I had used all of them in service of a business where no one had ever given me a title that meant anything. And when I sat down to write a resume, I had to figure out how to describe 6 years of indispensable work in a way that would make sense to a stranger who had no reason to take my word for it. I sent out more than 30 applications over the course of 5 weeks. Most of them went unanswered. A few led to first interviews that did not lead to second interviews. One company came back to me with an offer that was significantly below what I had asked for, and I turned it down, not because I could necessarily afford to, but because accepting it felt like agreeing with the assessment my father had made of my value, and I was not ready to do that. The firm that eventually hired me was a mid-sized business restructuring consultancy, and they brought me in at an analyst level that was technically entry-level for someone my age. I took it because the work was exactly the kind of thing I had been doing quietly for 6 years, except that in this environment it was the entire point of the company. Nobody there thought financial analysis was a secondary function. They thought it was the job. The first case I worked on was a packaging manufacturer that had been losing cash for 18 months without anyone in leadership understanding precisely why. I spent 2 weeks inside their books before I could explain it clearly, and when I could, the explanation was detailed and specific enough that the senior consultant on the account asked me to present it directly to the client's board. I had never done that before. At Whitcomb Fabrication, I had built analyses for 6 years that Calvin reviewed privately and then summarized to other people in his own words, usually without mentioning where the underlying work had come from. Standing in a boardroom and presenting my own findings to people who were paying attention and asking real questions was a different experience entirely. It was the first time I understood from the outside what my father had never been willing to see, that the work I did was not background support. It was the thing the whole decision rested on. Within a year, I had been promoted twice and was leading my own cases. Within 2 years, I had a reputation inside the firm as someone who could walk into a distressed manufacturing operation and identify the precise points where it was failing faster than almost anyone else on the team. I could read a company's financial position and tell where the cash was actually going, which contracts were quietly destroying margin, which supplier relationships were unsustainable, and what needed to change first to stop the bleeding before anything else could be addressed. These were not theoretical abilities. I had spent 6 years developing them inside a real company where the consequences of getting them wrong were immediate, financial, and personal, and that experience made me sharper at the work than people who had learned it only from case studies and classroom models. It was through that work that I met Celia Harwood. She was an investor who specialized in acquiring struggling manufacturing businesses, restructuring them and bringing them back to operational health, not by cutting everything indiscriminately, but by identifying what was actually working underneath the mismanagement and building from there. She had been doing this for nearly 20 years and had a way of evaluating a business that reminded me of the way I had always looked at numbers, not as abstract figures, but as a story about decisions someone had made and what those decisions had actually cost. She brought me in as an outside analyst on one of her acquisitions, then asked me back for another, and eventually made an offer that was not about a single project, but about a longer-term working relationship. Celia was not a mentor in the conventional sense. She did not sit across a desk and tell me what I needed to learn. She put me in rooms where the stakes were real, watched how I handled them, and adjusted what she asked of me based on what she saw. When I made a mistake, and I made mistakes, she told me specifically what the error was and what the correct analysis should have been, then moved forward without making it a larger conversation than it needed to be. Over the course of several years, she involved me in multiple acquisitions across different stages. By the later ones, I was not functioning as an analyst. I was helping structure the deals themselves, deciding what was worth saving and what the recovery path actually required. Northvale Industrial Holdings came together over about a year of conversations between me, Celia, and two other investors whose capital and confidence in the model made the thing possible. The name was mine. The focus was deliberate. We were not looking for high-profile turnarounds or businesses with interesting stories. We were looking for companies that made real things, had real customers, and had arrived at their current difficulty because of management failures rather than fundamental market problems. Those businesses could be fixed. They required patience, precision, and the willingness to do the unglamorous work of rebuilding systems, relationships, and financial discipline from the inside out. That was the work I had been doing my whole career. It was just that now I was doing it inside companies I actually owned a piece of. By the time Northvale had completed its third acquisition, I was not thinking much about Fort Wayne. I was not tracking what was happening at Whitcomb Fabrication, not out of discipline exactly, but because I had become occupied with my own life in a way I had not been when I was living inside my family's. There were days, fewer as time went on, when a specific memory from the company would surface, a conversation with my father, or a number I had spent weeks getting right only to have it summarized away by someone else, and I would feel the specific weight of those years settle briefly in my chest before I moved on. I was not healed of it. I am not sure healed is even the right word, but I was building something that was real and mine, and the distance between who I had been in that back office and who I was becoming was growing in a direction that felt for the first time entirely correct. The file arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, about 4 years after I left. It came through one of the standard industry channels we monitored for acquisition targets, a manufacturing business in the Fort Wayne area, asking for strategic investor interest. The summary described a regional metal fabrication and industrial supply company with an established client base, experienced workforce, and solid equipment assets, currently facing liquidity pressure from an over-leveraged expansion and declining order volume from a key customer account. The company was seeking capital investment or acquisition to address near-term obligations and stabilize operations. I recognized the logo before I finished reading the first paragraph. The logo had not changed. Neither had the address. I sat with the file open on my screen for a long time without doing anything with it. I read the summary 3 times, not because I needed to reread it, but because I was doing the thing you do when your mind is processing something it was not prepared to receive. The expansion. Derek had pushed through the second production line. The large loan, the conditional letter of intent I had warned them about, had failed in almost exactly the sequence I had described in the analysis my father thanked me for before ignoring. The agricultural equipment manufacturer had reduced its order volume. The second production line was running significantly below capacity. The loan remained, and Derek had apparently responded to the cash pressure by borrowing additional working capital rather than restructuring the operation, which had compounded the problem rather than addressed it. A regional bank now held a substantial portion of the company's assets as collateral. The Whitcomb family needed a buyer or investor within a matter of months, or the bank's remedies would move forward on their own timeline. I thought about closing the file and routing it to someone else on the Northvale team. That was a legitimate option, and I considered it seriously. I was not sure I could evaluate this particular opportunity with the objectivity that a real acquisition required, and objectivity was the thing the work depended on. I was still thinking about how to handle it when Celia came into my office for a separate conversation, noticed the file on my screen, and asked me what I was looking at. I told her. She read the summary without saying anything, and then she asked me a question that was short enough to sound simple, and was not simple at all. She asked whether if this were any other company and any other family, Northvale would buy it. I went back to the numbers, not the family history, not the dinner table, not the keys I had left on my father's desk, just the numbers. I looked at the customer list, the equipment valuation, the workforce tenure data, the regional market position, the underlying product demand. The business had real assets. It had long-term customers who had been buying from Whitcomb Fabrication for years, before Derek's expansion created the crisis. The workers on the floor were experienced and had not been the source of the company's problems. The brand had real recognition among Midwest industrial contractors in a way that a new entrant to the market would have to spend years building. The problems were not structural to the business. They were structural to the management, which was exactly the kind of situation Northvale was built to address. My answer to Celia's question was yes. Not because of anything I felt about my family, and not in spite of it either. Simply because the business, evaluated on its own terms, was worth acquiring and restructuring. We sent the initial offer through standard channels. We did not disclose who was behind Northvale. That was not unusual practice. Buyers routinely maintain confidentiality in early-stage discussions, and I had no particular strategic reason for the concealment beyond wanting the decision to be made based on what the deal actually was, not on whatever my family felt about me the moment they found out I was on the other side of it. Calvin's response to the offer was to reject it and tell my mother they were going to find another solution. He still believed, according to what reached me through the due diligence process, that the company was experiencing temporary difficulty, and that the right move was another financing arrangement rather than any kind of equity transaction. He spent the better part of 2 months pursuing that alternative. During that time, Derek was managing the financial reality in ways I only understood fully once our team completed its review of the company's books. He had been delaying payments to key suppliers to preserve the operating account balance. He had been shifting certain costs across accounting periods to smooth the reported figures. He had used funds allocated for quarterly tax obligations to cover payroll on at least 2 occasions, which created a liability that was not visible in the summary financials, but became very clear when our team examined the underlying records. The due diligence confirmed what I had suspected when I first read the file. The company's actual position was worse than the initial disclosures indicated. But it also confirmed something else: the core business remained recoverable. The right restructuring plan implemented with discipline and a clean capital structure could stabilize Whitcomb Fabrication and preserve the majority of the jobs that depended on it. Our team worked through those numbers carefully and put together a final offer. Northvale would acquire controlling interest, address the critical financial obligations, and provide the capital necessary for a proper restructuring. In exchange, the Whitcomb family would relinquish operational control of the company. Calvin turned it down. He told the intermediary that he would rather lose the company than hand it to outsiders. I did not intervene. He had the right to make that choice, and the consequences of making it were not something I was willing to shield him from. I had warned this family once about a financial decision that was going to hurt them, and they had not listened, and I had spent 4 years building a life that did not depend on their willingness to hear me. I was not going to repeat that particular dynamic. I let him say no, and I waited. The call that changed everything came on a Friday morning in late autumn. A regional bank had issued a formal notice of covenant violation on Whitcomb Fabrication's primary credit facility. The trigger was a missed financial performance threshold that Derek had apparently been managing around for 3 quarters through the accounting adjustments our team had already identified. The notice gave the company a short window to cure or reach a resolution before enforcement proceedings could begin. The same week, a client that represented a significant portion of active revenue terminated their contract, effective immediately, citing concerns about Whitcomb Fabrication's operational reliability concerns that had been accumulating for some time without anyone in management addressing them directly. A major steel supplier suspended delivery pending payment of an overdue balance. By Thursday of that week, the production floor had slowed to a fraction of normal activity. By Friday, there was not enough cash in the operating account to meet payroll for more than 100 workers. Derek finally told my parents the truth, that Friday afternoon, not the managed version he had been presenting for months, but the real numbers, the full scope of what the accounts actually contained and what the outstanding obligations actually were. My mother described it as the worst afternoon of her life, and I believe her. My father, who had spent 15 years building something he was deeply proud of, sat in his office and understood for the first time that the business he had refused to sell to outsiders might not survive long enough for the question to matter anymore. There was one buyer still at the table. Northvale Industrial Holdings had kept the offer open, and now the bank was pressing for a resolution, and the only resolution with enough capital and a concrete plan was the one Calvin had already turned down. A meeting was arranged. My father and Derek and Marjorie drove to the law offices where Miles Corbin had arranged the session. Celia was there. The bank's representatives were there. The room had the particular atmosphere of a conversation where almost everyone present already knows how it ends. Then the door opened and I walked in. Not as Calvin Whitcomb's daughter. Not as the woman who had left her keys on his desk 4 years earlier. I walked in as the founder and managing partner of Northvale Industrial Holdings, and I set the acquisition file on the conference table in front of my father, and I watched him look at me the way a person looks at something they are certain they have understood correctly and are now realizing they have never understood at all. Derek did not speak. Marjorie's face went the particular color of someone trying to process two things at once and managing neither. My father looked at me for a long time across the table, and in the silence before anyone said anything, I thought about the parking lot outside his office 4 years ago and the words he had said with such complete certainty. He had not been trying to hurt me. He had simply believed without any doubt at all that he was right, and he had been wrong about the one thing he was most certain of. But this was not where the story ended. This was where the hardest decision actually began. My father's first instinct was anger. That has always been his default when reality arrives in a form he did not anticipate and cannot immediately control. He looked at me across the conference table, and I watched him cycle through the recognition, and then something that might have been shame moved briefly across his face before the anger settled in over it and stayed. He straightened in his chair, looked at Miles Corbin, then at Celia, then back at me, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has decided that attack is more manageable than acknowledgement. He said I had planned this. He said I had watched the company struggle, had access through industry channels to know exactly what was happening, and had waited until the moment the family had no leverage left before revealing myself as the buyer. He said this was calculated and deliberate, and that no daughter who actually cared about her family would have operated this way. He delivered all of it with the conviction of someone who needs the story to be a certain shape because the alternative shape is too uncomfortable to hold. My mother did not match his volume, but she found her own version of the same argument. She said that if I had the resources to purchase the company, I had the resources to help the family without taking the company away from them entirely. She said a loan, a quiet investment, some form of private arrangement between family members would have accomplished the same outcome, and that choosing acquisition over assistance told her something about my intentions that she found very difficult to accept. There was genuine pain in her voice alongside the accusation, and I did not dismiss the pain even while I understood that the accusation it was attached to was not accurate. Derek made the simplest argument of the three. He said this was about the dinner 4 years ago. He said everything I had done since leaving the career, the company, the offer sitting on the table in front of them was constructed in service of this moment, that my actual motivation was not business judgment but personal score settling, and that if I were honest with myself, I would admit it. He said it with the confidence of a man who has spent some time preparing the theory and is satisfied with how it sounds. He believed it. That was the part that was almost interesting. He believed completely that I was that simple, that the entirety of what I had built in 4 years could be reduced to a reaction to what he and my father had said at a dinner table. I had been on the receiving end of that family's version of me for long enough that the pressure of it in a room was familiar. I knew exactly what it was designed to produce: a defensive response and emotional reaction. The kind of conversation that shifts away from the actual terms on the table and into a renegotiation of history where I would always be at a disadvantage because they had a shared version of it, and I was the only dissenting account. I had lost those conversations before by engaging with them on their own terms. I was not going to do it again. I opened the acquisition file and began walking through the numbers, and my voice was level the entire time because the numbers did not require emotion to make their case. The outstanding loan balance, the current cash position against weekly payroll obligations, the covenant violation notice from the bank and the timeline it established, the supplier suspension and what it meant for production capacity in the short term, the client termination and the revenue gap it left, Derek's tax obligation deferral and the liability it had created. I did not present this as a prosecution. I presented it as context, because context was what the conversation required before any decision could be made. When I finished, I set out two options in plain language. The first was that the family declined the acquisition. The bank moved forward on its existing rights under the covenant violation, and the company's assets were subject to whatever process the bank determined was in its interest, which was unlikely to prioritize keeping the operation intact, the workforce employed, or the Whitcomb name on the building. The second was that Northvale completed the acquisition on the terms already outlined, addressed the critical obligations immediately, and implemented a restructuring plan designed to stabilize the business and preserve as many jobs as the recovered operation could support. Under the second option, the family would retain a minority equity position. They would not retain operational control. My father looked at the file for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and asked a question that I think he had been building toward since I walked through the door. "So this is your revenge?" I had thought about how I would answer that question if he asked it, not in preparation for this meeting specifically, but in the general way you think through things during 4 years of building a life you are trying to make sure is actually yours and not just a reaction to someone else's. The answer was straightforward, and I meant it completely. "No," I told him. "Revenge would be letting it die just so I could watch you lose it." There was nothing to add to that, so I did not add anything. The room went quiet in the way rooms get quiet when the actual center of a conversation has finally been reached and everyone present knows it. My father looked at the file again. My mother had stopped speaking. Derek was looking at the table. Miles Corbin made a quiet note on the pad in front of him. The difference between what I was offering and what revenge would have looked like was not a small distinction. I had the ability to do nothing and let the bank's process run its course. The outcome of that process would almost certainly have been the company's dissolution, equipment sold at auction, customer relationships terminated, the workforce scattered. That outcome would have been painful for my family. It also would have taken more than 100 people's jobs with it, people who had not made any of the decisions that created the crisis and had no way to protect themselves from its consequences. The fact that those people worked for a company owned by my family did not make their situation less real, and I was not willing to ignore it, because ignoring it might have felt satisfying to the part of me that remembered a parking lot in Fort Wayne and a sentence about never having built anything of value. That part of me did not get to make this decision. The person I had become over 4 years had a larger set of obligations than the person I had been when I left, and I was not going to shrink back into the smaller version of myself just because the situation offered me permission to. My father signed the agreement that afternoon. He did not sign it gracefully. He signed it the way a man signs something when every alternative has closed and the only question remaining is whether he will make the inevitable harder on himself than it needs to be. Marjorie signed as well. Derek's signature was required for certain components of the equity restructuring, and Miles Corbin walked him through each page with the patience of a professional who has done this many times and knows that resistance at this stage is usually about dignity rather than substance. The deal closed before the banking deadline. The restructuring began the following Monday. The first payments issued under Northvale's ownership went to the workforce full payroll on schedule, covering the week that had nearly not happened. Most of those employees never knew how close it had been, and I did not think it was necessary for them to find out. The second priority was the steel supplier, where we negotiated a payment plan on the overdue balance that allowed deliveries to resume within 10 days. The third was a direct conversation with the bank, which proceeded considerably more productively once we were on the other side of the covenant violation and could demonstrate a capitalized owner with an actual restructuring plan rather than a family trying to hold position with instruments they could no longer afford. The second production line, the one Derek had opened with the conditional contract and the large loan, was scaled back significantly. The equipment that could be redeployed into higher margin work was retained and repositioned. The rest was managed out of the asset base in a way that recovered value rather than writing it off entirely. The customer who had terminated their contract was not recoverable in the short term, and I did not spend energy trying to recover them. I spent energy on the existing customer base that had remained, understanding what they needed and whether we were actually delivering it, and in several cases making commitments. We had apparently been failing to keep for long enough that the relationships had started to quietly erode without anyone in management noticing the pattern. Derek's removal from the operational leadership was handled through the same framework we applied to any management assessment in a restructuring. We reviewed his track record, the decisions he had made, the outcomes they had produced, the specific actions he had taken during the liquidity crisis that compounded the company's exposure rather than reduced it. The record was clear, and the conclusion it supported was not a close call. He was no longer suited to an operational leadership role at this company, and keeping him in one would have been a decision made on the basis of family relationship rather than business judgment. I had spent years on the receiving end of decisions made that way, and I was not going to replicate the logic just because it now pointed in a more convenient direction for me. Derek left the company without being publicly characterized in any way that would make his future more difficult than it needed to be. He simply was no longer part of the operation, and the organization moved forward without the structure that had been built around protecting his position. My father was a different case, and I thought carefully about it. Calvin Whitcomb had made serious errors in judgment that had contributed substantially to the crisis I was now managing. He had also spent decades developing a level of technical knowledge about the fabrication process, the equipment, and the specific capabilities of the Fort Wayne operation that was not easily replaceable in the short term. Dismissing him entirely because he had dismissed me would have been the kind of symmetrical gesture that feels meaningful and costs you something real. I offered him a technical advisor role during the transition period with a defined scope and no operational authority. He accepted it without much discussion, which told me more than anything he said in that conference room had. My mother had no role in the post-acquisition company. She had not held an operational role in the business for several years before the acquisition, and there was no gap in the organization that her involvement would address. This was not a punishment, even though she understood it as one for a while. I let her work through that on her own timeline because explaining the distinction to someone not ready to hear it was a use of time and energy the company could not afford in that period, and neither could I. 18 months after the closing, Whitcomb Fabrication's operating cash flow had returned to positive territory for the first time in 3 years. The debt load had been reduced substantially through a combination of asset optimization and disciplined repayment. 3 customers who had been quietly pulling back their order volumes had re-engaged at levels close to what they had been before the operational reliability concerns took hold. We had added 14 people to the workforce, modest by any measure but meaningful in a business that had been facing the possibility of losing everyone. The management team below the ownership level was functioning with a degree of professional autonomy the company had never had under family control because Calvin had never fully trusted anyone outside the family with real authority, and that structural bottleneck had been one of the quieter contributors to the organization's fragility. None of this happened quickly or cleanly. Restructuring never does. There were months where the numbers improved more slowly than the model projected, and months where a customer decision or a supply chain issue created pressure that required immediate attention and solutions that had not been planned for. I was present for most of it in a way that felt different from how I had been present at Whitcomb Fabrication when it was my family's company. Then my presence had been necessary and invisible. Now it was mine in both directions, accountable not just for fixing problems, but for building something that would be more durable than what had existed before. 2 years after the acquisition closed, I drove to the factory on a Tuesday morning in early spring for a routine operational review. There was nothing ceremonial about it. I had been to the facility many times since the closing, and this visit was not different from the others in any way I had planned for it to be. I parked in the lot and walked through the main entrance and stood on the production floor for a few minutes before my first meeting watching the operation run. The machines were running. The morning shift was fully staffed. A truck was being loaded at the dock with an order going to a contractor in Ohio. The floor supervisor was walking the line checking something on a clipboard, and when he saw me, he raised a hand in acknowledgement and kept moving because the work did not stop for my presence the way it once would have stopped for Calvin's. That was a difference I had deliberately built into the culture of the operation, and seeing it function the way I had intended was one of the more satisfying things I had witnessed in 2 years of running this company. Near the corridor that led to the old executive offices, there was a mounted plaque on the wall listing the year Whitcomb Fabrication and Supply was founded and my parents' names as founders. I had noticed it on my first visit after the acquisition and had left it where it was. The history of the company was not falsified by the fact that its ownership had changed. The people who started it in a rented shop in Fort Wayne had built something real, and that reality did not become less true because of what had happened afterward. I was not interested in rewriting the record. I was interested in what the record was going to say from this point forward. My father was in the facility that morning as he was most Tuesdays in his advisory capacity. We crossed paths near the old tooling storage area, and he walked the line with me for a while without much conversation, the way two people walk together when they have arrived at a form of coexistence that is not warm, but is no longer hostile. At one point he stopped and looked at a part coming off the secondary press, a component for an HVAC contractor account that had been one of our most stable revenue sources through the entire restructuring, and he said something quietly almost to himself without looking at me directly. He said he had been wrong to think that only the people making things with their hands were building the business. He said it plainly, without decoration, in the voice of someone who has had a long time to arrive at a conclusion and is stating it now because the opportunity is there, and not stating it would be a different kind of error. It was not a full apology. It was not a renegotiation of the past. It was one man in his 60s saying out loud that he had misunderstood something important for a long time, and I believe it cost him something real to say it. I told him he was right that a company is not built by one person. I told him it is built by everyone who shows up to keep it running, the people on the floor, the people managing the accounts, the people making sure the cash is where it needs to be so that the machines can run and the workers can be paid and the customers can rely on what they ordered actually arriving. That was not a theory I had developed in the abstract. That was something I had understood from the inside of a real business since I was 26 years old, and it had taken me until I was the one whose name was on the ownership documents for anyone in my family to hear me say it. Derek found his own way forward eventually outside of the company and outside of the identity that had been constructed for him by parents who loved him in a way that did not prepare him for the actual weight of what they were promising him. My mother took longer than my father to reach any kind of acceptance, and I did not rush her. Whatever she was working through was hers to work through, and the timeline of it was not something I could manage or should try to. The thing I understood standing on that production floor 2 years after I had walked in as the buyer was, this the version of success I had arrived at, looked nothing like what I had imagined it would look like when I was 26, staying late to fix a cash flow model that nobody would thank me for fixing. It was quieter. It was more complicated. It was heavier than any form of personal vindication could have prepared me for. It did not feel like victory in the way the word usually implies something clean and final. It felt like the beginning of an ongoing obligation that I had chosen freely and was going to have to keep earning. My father had told me I had never built anything of value. What I know now is that the building was never actually about proving him wrong. The building was what happened when I stopped trying to be seen correctly by people who had already decided what they were going to see and started directing that energy towards something that would actually exist in the world when I was done. The plaque on the wall still carried my parents' names. The decisions going forward were mine. Both of those things were true at the same time, and learning to hold them both without needing to resolve the tension between them was the closest thing to peace this story was ever going to offer me. And it turned out to be more than enough. If this story stayed with you, it would mean a lot if you subscribed and shared it with someone who needs to hear it right now. someone whose work is going unseen, whose value is being decided by people who don't have the full picture. Because the most important thing this story is really about is not a company or a family or a legal agreement signed at a conference table. It is about what happens when you stop waiting for the people who underestimated you to change their minds and start building something that makes the question irrelevant.